March 6, 1836. Dawn breaks over San Antonio de Bexar, cold and gray. Inside the crumbling walls of the old Spanish mission known as the Alamo, 200 men wait for the end. Among them stands Davy Crockett, frontiersman, Congressman, living legend, the king of the wild frontier. For generations, we've been told he died the way heroes are supposed to, rifle in hand, swinging it like a club, surrounded by the bodies of the enemy he took down with him, a final, defiant blaze of glory that helped birth the Republic of Texas. But that story, as powerful as it is, doesn't hold up when you dig into the records that have been sitting there all along. Not the Hollywood version, not the Texas tall tales spun in the decades after the battle. The real accounts, from people who were actually there, paint a different picture, a quieter, darker one. And after nearly 2 centuries of debate, suppressed reports, and careful cross-checking by historians, the evidence lines up. We finally know what really happened to Davy Crockett at the Alamo. And it wasn't the last stand we thought. To get there, you have to understand who Crockett really was before he ever set foot in Texas. He wasn't some backwoods myth walking around in a coonskin cap for the cameras. Born in 1786 in what's now Tennessee, he grew up poor, barely schooled, but tough as hickory. He fought in the Creek War under Andrew Jackson in 1813, married twice, ran a farm, and somehow turned his plain-spoken ways into a political career. Elected to Congress in 1827, he became famous for bucking the establishment. He hated Jackson's Indian removal policies, called them out in blunt terms, and paid for it. When his district turned against him in 1835, Crockett told voters he was done. "You may all go to hell," he supposedly said, "and I will go to Texas." He wasn't kidding. At 49 years old, with a fresh start and a sense of adventure still burning, he headed west. He took a small group of Tennessee volunteers, maybe a dozen at first, later more, and arrived at the Alamo on February 8, 1836. The place was already a powder keg. Texas was in open revolt against Mexico. General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna had marched north with thousands of troops to crush the rebellion. The Alamo's commander, William Barrett Travis, had maybe 150 men when Crockett showed up. They were short on everything: food, powder, hope. But Crockett's arrival lifted spirits. He wasn't there to command. He was just another volunteer, playing his fiddle at night, cracking jokes, helping wherever he could. Santa Anna reached San Antonio on February 23rd. He raised a blood-red flag, no quarter. Travis answered with cannon fire. The siege dragged on for 13 days. Mexican artillery pounded the walls. Inside, the defenders patched holes, rationed meat, and waited. On March 4th, the final reinforcements trickled in, 32 men from Gonzales. It wasn't enough. Travis knew it. He drew his famous line in the dirt and gave every man the choice to stay or leave. They all stayed. Then came the night of March 5th. Santa Anna pulled his troops back, let the defenders think they had one more day. But at 4 in the morning on the 6th, the Mexican band struck up the eerie notes of the Degüello, the No Mercy song. 4 columns of soldiers, nearly 2,000 strong, charged the walls under covering fire from their own cannons. The defenders poured rifle fire into them. For a few frantic minutes, it looked like they might hold. Travis fell near the north wall, shot through the head. Jim Bowie, sick in bed with what was probably pneumonia or typhoid, was killed where he lay, slashing with his famous knife until the end. Crockett and his Tennesseans were posted at the low wooden palisade on the south side, the weakest point in the defenses. They fought like men who had nothing left to lose. But the numbers were overwhelming. Mexican troops poured over the walls in waves. Hand-to-hand fighting exploded in the courtyards and barracks. Smoke, screams, the crack of rifles and the thud of bayonets. By sunrise, it was over. The Alamo had fallen. Every last defender was dead. Santa Anna, ever the showman, toured the ruins that morning. He wanted to see the bodies of the famous ones, Travis, Bowie, and especially Crockett. What happened next is where the stories split wide open, and this is the part that got buried for decades. Right after the battle, word spread fast. Sam Houston, commander of the Texian army, got reports within days. In a letter dated March 11th, he wrote that after the fort was carried, 7 men surrendered and called for quarter. Santa Anna had them murdered on the spot. Houston didn't name names, but the implication was clear. Not every defender died fighting to the last bullet. Some tried to give up, and they were executed anyway. Other early accounts backed him up. Tejanos, who had been inside or nearby, confirmed it. Mexican officers who survived the campaign talked about it later. But back in the United States, those details didn't fit the story people wanted to hear. Texas needed martyrs. The revolution needed symbols. So the surrender and execution version got pushed aside. Instead, newspapers and pamphlets leaned hard on 2 survivors who had been allowed to leave the Alamo alive. Susanna Dickinson, wife of one of the defenders, and Joe, Travis's enslaved man. Both described seeing Crockett's body after the fighting stopped. Dickinson said he was lying dead and mutilated between the church and the barracks, his peculiar coonskin-style cap beside him. Joe said he died like a hero, surrounded by heaps of the enemy. For years, that was enough. It painted the picture everyone loved. Crockett, the last man standing, rifle-clubbed and swinging until they cut him down. But here's what those accounts actually leave out. Neither Dickinson nor Joe claimed they saw Crockett die. They only saw his body afterward while Mexican troops were still swarming the compound. The bodies hadn't been moved yet. The scene they witnessed could just as easily have been the aftermath of a summary execution in the open courtyard. And Mexican reports from the same day tell a very different story. The most detailed one comes from Colonel José Enrique de la Peña, an officer who took part in the assault. His diary, written in the weeks and months after the battle and later authenticated by scholars, is brutal in its honesty. De la Peña described how a handful of defenders, 7 in total, survived the initial carnage. They were rounded up and brought before Santa Anna under the protection of General Manuel Castrillon, who argued they should be spared as prisoners of war. One of them stood out. De la Peña wrote, "Among them was one of great stature, well-proportioned, with regular features, in whose face there was the imprint of adversity, but in whom one also noticed a degree of resignation and nobility that did him honor. He was the naturalist David Crockett." Santa Anna wasn't interested in prisoners. According to de la Peña, he answered Castrillon's plea with a gesture of indignation. He turned to the sappers, the engineered troops closest to him, and ordered the execution. What followed was ugly. Some of the officers, eager to flatter their commander, stepped forward with swords drawn. They thrust themselves forward, de la Peña wrote, in order to flatter their commander, and with swords in hand, fell upon these unfortunate, defenseless men, just as a tiger leaps upon his prey. Though tortured before they were killed, these unfortunates died without complaining and without humiliating themselves before their torturers. De la Peña didn't hide his disgust. He called it murder. He questioned what possible advantage Santa Anna gained by killing men who could have been used to spread fear among the remaining Texian forces. But the order stood, and Crockett was among those 7. That account didn't surface in English until 1975, when the diary was translated and published. It caused an uproar. Some called it a forgery. Others said it was Mexican propaganda meant to tarnish a Texas hero. But over the next 30 years, historians dug deeper. The original Spanish manuscript was examined. Paper, ink, handwriting, all checked out. Independent scholars like David B. Gracie II at the University of Texas confirmed it was genuine. More importantly, de la Peña's version matched earlier scattered reports that had been ignored or dismissed because they didn't match the legend. Ramon Martinez Caro, Santa Anna's own secretary, wrote about 5 or 6 men being brought forward after the fighting and executed on the general's orders. Other Mexican officers gave similar testimony in the years that followed. Even some of the earliest American newspaper stories from March and April 1836 mentioned Crockett and others trying to surrender, only to be told there was no mercy. So why did the heroic Last Stand version win out for so long? Simple. It was better storytelling. In the 1880s, Texas historians like Reuben Potter dismissed the surrender reports as calumny against the hero. In the 1950s, Walt Disney turned Crockett into a national icon with the coonskin cap craze and a hit TV miniseries that ended with him swinging that rifle on the Alamo ramparts. School books, movies, even the Alamo itself as a tourist site leaned into the myth. It was easier to sell tickets and build pride around a man who never quit than one who fought hard, got captured, and was cut down in cold blood. But the documents don't lie. When you line them up, the Houston letter from March 11th, the New Orleans newspapers, the Mexican officer's consistent descriptions, and de la Peña's eyewitness detail, the pattern is unmistakable. Crockett almost certainly lived through the worst of the fighting. He and a small group were taken alive. Santa Anna, furious at the losses his army had suffered and determined to make an example, ordered them killed on the spot. Swords, not bullets, close enough to look the men in the eye. No quarter, just as the red flag had promised. That doesn't make Crockett any less brave. He rode into a hopeless fight knowing the odds. He stayed when he could have left. He stood his ground at the weakest part of the wall with his Tennessee boys. The evidence suggests he fought until there was no more fighting to be done. What happened after that was out of his hands. It was politics and rage and the brutal logic of a dictator who wanted the rebellion crushed in blood. The bodies were burned on pyres the next day. Santa Anna moved on to chase Sam Houston. 2 weeks later, at San Jacinto, the Texians would scream, "Remember the Alamo," and turn the tide. But the man whose name became shorthand for that battle didn't go down the way the songs and the statues say he did. We know this now because historians finally stopped protecting the legend and started reading the records straight. The diary, the letters, the cross-checked testimonies, they all point the same direction. Davy Crockett didn't die swinging a rifle in a blaze of glory. He died because Santa Anna refused to let him live. Executed with 6 or 7 others in the courtyard of the Alamo, swords flashing in the morning light. It's a harder truth, less cinematic, but it's the one that fits the facts. And in the end, that's what history owes us. Not the story we wish were true, but the one that actually happened. The Alamo still stands today, quiet and sun-baked, a reminder of what 200 men were willing to risk. Somewhere in that soil lie the ashes of a Tennessee congressman who once told the world he'd go to Texas when his own country turned its back on him. He went, he fought, and when the fighting stopped, they killed him anyway. That's what we finally know about how Davy Crockett died at the Alamo. Not with a Hollywood bang, but with the quiet finality of an order no one dared to disobey. The frontier legend ended not in defiance, but in defiance denied. And somehow, knowing the real ending makes the beginning matter even more.